In the quiet town of Evergreen, where the streets were lined with oak trees and life seemed ordinary, an unusual relationship began to brew. 16-year-old Clara, a bright but rebellious teenager, often wandered alone in the neighborhood, searching for excitement in her otherwise monotonous life. Her parents, consumed with work, had little time to notice Clara's increasing solitude and the unconventional friendships she was forming. One afternoon, while exploring a quiet corner of town, Clara met Walter, a 90-year-old retired historian living in an old ivy-covered house. Walter, widowed for decades, had lived a solitary life, surrounded by dusty books and faded photographs. He was a man of few visitors, except for the occasional delivery man. Their meeting was accidental. Clara had wandered into his garden, intrigued by the peculiar assortment of statues and artifacts scattered around. Walter caught her inspecting an ancient sundial. Instead of reprimanding her, he invited her in, offering lemonade and stories about his life. From that day, an unlikely friendship formed. Clara visited Walter often, enchanted by his tales of adventures in far-off lands and his impressive collection of antiques. Walter, in turn, found Clara's youthful energy refreshing, reminding him of a time long gone. Their bond deepened as weeks turned into months, with Clara finding solace in Walter's attention and Walter relishing the company he had long missed. But beneath the surface of this peculiar friendship lay troubling undertones. Walter's interest in Clara grew obsessive, and Clara, feeling empowered by his fascination, began to manipulate him subtly. She would flirt innocently, playing on his emotions, while Walter showered her with gifts, including expensive jewelry and even cash. Whispers began to circulate in the neighborhood. People noticed Clara's frequent visits to Walter's house and began to question the nature of their relationship. Clara's classmates teased her about her old boyfriend, while Walter's housekeeper, Mrs. Lark, expressed concern over the girl's influence on him. One evening, Clara's mother, Diana, stumbled upon a gold bracelet in Clara's room, a gift from Walter. Confronting Clara, Diana demanded to know the truth. Clara brushed it off as harmless, insisting that Walter was just a lonely old man who enjoyed her company. Diana, uneasy but unsure of what to do, let the matter slide. Meanwhile, Walter's obsession reached dangerous levels. He began to withdraw from his few remaining friends and spent his days writing letters to Clara, expressing his undying affection. Clara, increasingly uncomfortable with his advances, tried to distance herself, but Walter wouldn't let go. One fateful night, Clara decided to end the relationship once and for all. She confronted Walter in his home, demanding that he stop contacting her. What started as a heated argument escalated into a violent altercation. The next morning, Walter was found dead in his study, his lifeless body slumped over his desk, blood pooling on the floor. The town was in shock. How could such a quiet, elderly man meet such a brutal end? The police were called, and the seasoned detective, Inspector Grace Holloway, was assigned to the case. Known for her sharp instincts and methodical approach, Inspector Holloway vowed to uncover the truth behind Walter's death. The morning after Walter's body was discovered, Inspector Grace Holloway arrived at the scene. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving even the most perplexing cases, she surveyed Walter's study with a practiced eye. The room bore signs of a struggle, a shattered vase on the floor, papers scattered across the desk, and a bloodied fireplace poker lying nearby. Walter's lifeless body was slumped over his desk, a large wound at the back of his head. The coroner estimated the time of death to be between 10 p.m. and midnight. Nothing seemed stolen, but a locked drawer in the desk had been forced open. Inside, Holloway found several letters addressed to "My dearest Clara." The letters were filled with emotional declarations, hinting at an unusual bond. They spoke of gifts, secret meetings, and a deep longing for her presence. Inspector Holloway carefully bagged the evidence, her suspicions growing. Walter's housekeeper, Mrs. Lark, was the first to be questioned. A middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, she admitted she had been wary of Clara's frequent visits. "I told him it wasn't proper," Mrs. Lark said, her hands trembling. "But he wouldn't listen. That girl had a hold over him. She was here yesterday afternoon, arguing with him. I could hear them from the kitchen. She stormed out around 6 p.m., slamming the door." Holloway's next stop was Clara's home. She found the teenager in her room, staring at her phone with a blank expression. Clara's mother, Diana, hovered nearby, clearly distressed. "What's this about?" Clara asked defensively when Holloway introduced herself. "I'm here about Walter," Holloway replied, studying Clara's reaction. Clara's face paled, but she quickly masked her emotions. "What about him?" "He's dead," Holloway said bluntly. "Murdered." Clara's eyes widened. I I didn't know. That's horrible." "Were you there yesterday evening?" Holloway pressed. "I stopped by in the afternoon," Clara admitted. "But we argued and I left. I didn't go back." "What was the argument about?" Clara hesitated. He he was getting too attached. I told him I couldn't visit anymore. It upset him." Holloway noted the vague answer, but didn't press further. Diana, visibly upset, asked, "Are you suggesting Clara had something to do with this?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Holloway replied calmly, "but I need to understand the nature of their relationship." Diana glared at her daughter. "You told me it was innocent." "It was," Clara snapped. "He was lonely, and I like listening to his stories. That's all." Holloway left the house with more questions than answers. Back at the station, she reviewed the evidence collected so far. The letters painted a picture of a man deeply infatuated, perhaps even obsessed. Clara's behavior seemed suspicious, but there was no concrete proof linking her to the murder. A background check on Walter revealed a clean record, but his financial history raised eyebrows. In the months leading up to his death, he had made several large withdrawals from his savings. Holloway suspected these were gifts for Clara. The autopsy report confirmed that Walter had died from a blow to the head. The fireplace poker was the likely murder weapon, and forensic tests were underway to check for fingerprints. As Holloway pieced together the timeline, she couldn't shake the feeling that Clara knew more than she was letting on. But was she capable of murder? Or was there someone else involved? Holloway decided to dig deeper into Clara's life. She interviewed her classmates, uncovering rumors about her old boyfriend and stories of her flaunting expensive jewelry. One classmate mentioned seeing Clara argue with an older man outside a cafe the week before Walter's death. Inspector Grace Holloway sat in her dimly lit office, the soft hum of the city outside providing an odd sense of calm. The case was shaping up to be more complex than she initially thought. Clara's story seemed carefully rehearsed, and Walter's obsession hinted at a relationship that went beyond mere companionship. With the surveillance footage from Walter's neighborhood ready for review, Holloway knew the next few hours could be critical. The footage revealed several key details. At 10:15 p.m. on the night of the murder, a figure wearing a hooded sweatshirt approached Walter's house. The grainy video made it impossible to identify the person, but their movements were deliberate. The figure entered through the side gate and disappeared from view. At 11:07 p.m., the same figure emerged and hurried away, clutching what appeared to be a bag. Holloway replayed the footage repeatedly, noting the figure's height and build. While it matched Clara's general physique, it wasn't enough to confirm her involvement. She sent the footage to the forensic team, hoping they could enhance the images. Her next step was to re-examine Walter's house. Accompanied by officers, Holloway returned to the crime scene, combing through every detail. In the study, she noticed a faint trail of mud leading from the side door to the desk. It wasn't visible at first glance, but became clear under closer inspection. "Bag the samples," she instructed an officer. In the drawer where Walter kept the letters, Holloway found something she'd overlooked earlier: a torn photograph. The edges suggested it had been ripped in anger. The image showed Clara and Walter in his garden, sitting closer than what most would consider appropriate. Clara wore the gold bracelet her mother had found, and Walter's expression was one of pure adoration. Later that day, the forensic team delivered results on the fireplace poker. Multiple fingerprints were found, including Clara's and Mrs. Lark's. Holloway questioned the housekeeper again. "I cleaned that poker a few days ago," Mrs. Lark explained nervously. "Clara must have touched it during one of her visits." "Why didn't you mention that earlier?" Holloway asked. "I didn't think it mattered," Mrs. Lark stammered. "I thought you'd find the killer quickly." Holloway remained skeptical. Mrs. Lark had access to the house and clearly disapproved of Clara. Could she have acted out of anger, trying to protect Walter from what she saw as exploitation? Holloway decided to confront Clara again, armed with the new evidence. She arrived at Clara's school just as classes were ending. Pulling Clara aside, she laid the torn photograph on the table between them. Explain this, Holloway demanded. Clara's eyes darted to the photo, then away. It's just a picture. He wanted to take it. I didn't think it was a big deal. Why was it torn? I don't know, Clara said, her voice trembling. Maybe he got upset when I said I couldn't see him anymore. You're lying, Holloway pressed. You were at his house the night he died. Surveillance footage shows someone matching your description entering and leaving. Your fingerprints are on the murder weapon. Tell me the truth. Tears welled up in Clara's eyes. Okay, I went back to talk to him, but I didn't kill him. I swear. Then who did? Clara hesitated. There was someone else, she whispered. When I left, I saw a man near the gate. He was tall and wearing a dark coat. I thought he was just a neighbor or something. Why didn't you say this before? Holloway asked, her tone sharp. I was scared, Clara admitted. I didn't want anyone to think I was involved. Holloway noted Clara's words but wasn't sure whether to believe her. If there was another person involved, they'd left no obvious trace. Back at the station, Holloway reviewed the case file, piecing together the timeline. Walter's financial records showed another large withdrawal the day before his death. Who was he paying, and why? The final piece of the day's puzzle arrived in the form of enhanced footage from the forensic team. The hooded figure's face was still obscured, but their bag appeared to be made of leather with a distinctive emblem. Holloway recognized it immediately. It was a bag commonly used by courier services. If the figure was a courier, they might not be the murderer, but they could be the key to unraveling what really happened that night. The investigation was far from over, and the shadows surrounding Walter's death grew darker with every discovery. Inspector Grace Holloway leaned back in her chair, studying the grainy image of the leather bag carried by the hooded figure in the surveillance footage. The emblem was distinct, a golden compass with an arrow running through it. Holloway recognized it as the logo of Speed Swift Couriers, a local delivery service often used for discreet transactions. Without wasting time, she placed a call to Speed Swift, requesting a list of deliveries made to Walter's address in the past month. By mid-afternoon, a representative arrived with the records. Holloway scanned the list, her eyes narrowing on a delivery marked for the night of Walter's murder. Who made this delivery, she asked. The representative checked their tablet. It was Alex Reed. He's one of our night couriers. Where can I find him? The representative hesitated. I'm not sure. He hasn't shown up for work in 2 days. That's unusual for him. Holloway's instincts kicked in. She requested Alex Reed's address and immediately dispatched a team to locate him. An hour later, Holloway and her officers arrived at a rundown apartment complex on the edge of town. The building reeked of neglect, with peeling paint and broken light fixtures. Alex Reed's apartment was on the 3rd floor. Knocking on the door, Holloway announced herself. Police! Open up! There was no response. After several more attempts, she ordered the door to be forced open. Inside, the apartment was in disarray. Empty beer bottles littered the floor, and the air was heavy with the smell of stale smoke. In the corner of the living room, they found Alex Reed slumped on the couch, his face pale and his breathing shallow. On the coffee table lay a syringe and a small packet of white powder. Call an ambulance, Holloway ordered. As paramedics attended to Alex, Holloway's team searched the apartment. In the bedroom closet, they found the leather bag from the surveillance footage. Inside it were envelopes containing cash, along with a handwritten note that read, "Delivered to Mr. Walter Green. Use discretion." The evidence was damning, but it also raised more questions. What was Alex delivering, and why had Walter been willing to pay such a high price for it? At the hospital, Alex Reed regained consciousness after being treated for a drug overdose. Holloway wasted no time questioning him. Alex, you were at Walter Green's house the night he was murdered, she said firmly. What were you delivering? Alex groaned, rubbing his temples. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. We found your bag and we have you on camera entering and leaving his property. Alex sighed, his defenses crumbling. Fine. I was delivering something for a guy named Marcus. He told me not to ask questions, just drop it off and collect the payment. Marcus who? I don't know his last name, Alex admitted. He's a shady guy, deals in antiques, collectibles, that kind of stuff. He paid me extra to keep my mouth shut. What was in the package? A small wooden box. It looked old, like something from a museum. I didn't open it. Holloway's mind raced. Walter's fascination with artifacts and history was well known. Could this box have been connected to his murder? Where can I find Marcus? He hangs out at the old pawn shop on Fifth Street, Alex muttered. The next day, Holloway and her team arrived at the pawn shop. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the shelves were cluttered with trinkets, tools, and jewelry. A man in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and piercing eyes, leaned against the counter. Marcus? Holloway asked. Depends on who's asking, he replied, sizing her up. Inspector Grace Holloway. I need to ask you some questions about a package delivered to Walter Green the night he was murdered. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his grip on the counter tightened. I don't know anything about that. You're lying, Holloway said coldly. I have a courier who says otherwise. If you don't cooperate, I'll charge you with obstruction of justice. After a tense silence, Marcus relented. Fine. I sold Walter a rare artifact, an old medallion. He was desperate to get his hands on it. What kind of medallion? It's from the 18th century, supposedly cursed or something. I don't believe in that crap, but Walter was obsessed. He paid a fortune for it. Where is it now? I don't know. I delivered it, and that's the last I saw of it. Holloway left the pawn shop with more pieces of the puzzle, but no clear answers. The medallion, Walter's obsession, Clara's involvement, and Alex's delivery were all connected. But how? Back at the station, she reviewed the case file again. Something about the timeline didn't add up. If the medallion was the key, why had Walter been killed so violently? And where was the medallion now? The mystery deepened, and Holloway knew she was racing against time to unravel the truth before the killer struck again. Inspector Grace Holloway sat in her office, a faint headache building as she pieced together the threads of the investigation. The medallion Marcus had mentioned intrigued her. If it was truly rare and valuable, it could be a motive for murder. But why was Walter so desperate to own it? And how did Clara fit into this tangled web? She ordered her team to dig deeper into Marcus's dealings, Walter's financial records, and any documentation about the medallion's history. The report from forensics arrived shortly after. Traces of Walter's blood had been found on the leather bag, suggesting that Alex or someone connected to him might have been more involved than they were letting on. Holloway decided to bring Clara in for further questioning. This time, she brought the torn photograph and the note found in Alex's bag. Clara, I need you to tell me everything, Holloway began, her voice firm but calm. Walter was murdered over something he was hiding. What do you know about a medallion he recently bought? Clara's face turned pale. Medallion? He never told me about a medallion. Holloway leaned forward. Don't lie to me. Walter was obsessed with you, Clara. He trusted you. If he had something valuable, he might have mentioned it. Clara hesitated, then sighed. He showed me something once. It was a gold coin or medallion. I don't know much about it, but he said it was special. He wouldn't stop talking about how it could change his life. Change his life how? He said it had some kind of power, Clara said, her voice trembling. He sounded crazy, like he really believed it. I thought it was just another one of his stories. Did he tell anyone else about it? Clara shook her head. He was paranoid. He said people might try to steal it. Holloway studied Clara's expression carefully. She was telling the truth, at least about this. The next lead came from Walter's financial records. He had wired a substantial amount of money to a Swiss bank account a week before his death. The recipient was an unknown entity, but the timing suggested it was related to the medallion. Holloway's team also uncovered a local legend tied to the artifact. According to historical archives, the medallion was rumored to have belonged to a wealthy merchant in the 18th century. The merchant had mysteriously died, and his fortune vanished, fueling rumors that the medallion was cursed. Over the centuries, it had changed hands, with each owner meeting a tragic end. Superstition or not, someone wanted that medallion badly enough to kill for it, Holloway muttered. She returned to the pawn shop to confront Marcus. You didn't tell me everything, Holloway said, slamming a copy of the legend on the counter. What do you know about the medallion's history? Marcus smirked nervously. I figured you'd dig that up. Look, I sell things. I don't care about curses or whatever. Walter wanted it, so I got it for him. That's it. Who else knew you sold it to him? No one, Marcus insisted. I'm not stupid. If word got out, someone might come after me. Holloway didn't believe him entirely, but there was no evidence to prove otherwise. She left, frustrated but determined. Back at the station, her team had made a breakthrough. The mud samples from Walter's house contained traces of a rare clay found only in a quarry outside town. The quarry had been closed for years, but someone had been there recently. Holloway immediately headed to the site. The abandoned quarry was eerily silent, its rocky walls towering above like ancient sentinels. She found faint tire tracks leading to a hidden alcove. Inside, she discovered a small camp with remnants of a fire and an empty metal box, the kind that could hold something small and valuable, like a medallion. Nearby, she spotted footprints leading toward the woods. Following the trail, she found a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It matched the description of the hooded figure's clothing. Inspector Grace Holloway was shocked by the forensics report. Clara's fingerprints on the medallion box were undeniable evidence that she'd been more involved than she had let on. But why? And how deeply was she entangled in Walter's death? Holloway didn't hesitate to bring Clara in for questioning again. This time, the tone was sharper, the questions more direct. Clara, we found your fingerprints on a box at the quarry, the same quarry where someone tried to hide the medallion Walter bought. You've been lying to me. Clara's face turned pale. I didn't kill him. I swear I didn't kill him. Then explain how your prints ended up on that box. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Okay, I'll tell you everything. Holloway leaned back, arms crossed, and waited. Clara's confession came out in a jumble of fear and regret. A few weeks before Walter's death, he had shown her the medallion and told her it was worth a fortune. Walter claimed it held mysterious powers, but Clara didn't believe in such things. What mattered to her was that Walter had promised to share the wealth with her. He said we could run away together, Clara said, her voice shaking. He wanted to leave everything behind, his house, his reputation. He thought the medallion would make us rich enough to start over. But things had spiraled out of control when Walter's housekeeper, Mrs. Lark, discovered the medallion. She overheard us talking about it, Clara admitted. She warned him it was dangerous, that people might come after him for it. But Walter didn't care. He thought she was just jealous or trying to scare him. According to Clara, Walter became increasingly paranoid, especially after receiving threats from an unknown caller. Clara had no idea who the caller was, but she suspected it was someone connected to Marcus, the man who sold the medallion. Walter gave me the box one night, Clara continued. He said he needed me to keep it safe. I was scared, but I agreed. Why did you take it to the quarry? Holloway asked. Clara hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone followed me. I didn't know what else to do. I panicked and hid the box there. I planned to go back for it, but then Walter was killed. Holloway's mind raced. Clara's story explained some of the evidence, but raised even more questions. Who had threatened Walter, and who had followed Clara to the quarry? The following morning, Holloway turned her focus to Mrs. Lark. The housekeeper had been loyal to Walter for years, but her fingerprints on the murder weapon and her knowledge of the medallion made her a key suspect. Mrs. Lark, I need you to come to the station for further questioning, Holloway said when she arrived at Walter's house. Mrs. Lark seemed flustered, but complied. At the station, Holloway wasted no time. You knew about the medallion, Holloway began. You overheard Walter talking about it with Clara. Yes, Mrs. Lark admitted. I told him it was dangerous, but he wouldn't listen. He was obsessed. Why were your fingerprints on the fireplace poker? Mrs. Lark's hands trembled. I don't know. I might have touched it while cleaning. I didn't kill him. Holloway studied her carefully. Mrs. Lark seemed genuinely frightened, but Holloway knew fear could be a mask for guilt. Did you see or hear anything unusual the night Walter was killed? Mrs. Lark hesitated before answering. There was a man. I saw him near the gate earlier that evening. He looked suspicious, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to cause trouble. Can you describe him? He was tall, wearing a dark coat and a hat. I couldn't see his face. Holloway's instincts flared. The description matched the figure Clara had mentioned. Back at the station, Holloway's team uncovered another lead. A local pawn shop owner reported that someone had tried to sell an antique medallion just days after Walter's murder. The description matched the one Walter had purchased. Holloway immediately tracked down the seller, a man named Richard Dane, who had a history of petty theft and fraud. When officers brought him in, Holloway confronted him with the evidence. "Where did you get the medallion?" she demanded. Richard smirked. "Found it at the quarry, just lying there." "You expect me to believe that?" "Believe what you want, lady. I'm telling you the truth." Holloway's frustration mounted, but she knew she was close to unraveling the mystery. Late that night, as Holloway reviewed the case file again, something clicked. Walter's death, Clara's involvement, the medallion's disappearance. It all pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan. But who was pulling the strings? One detail stood out: the unknown caller who had threatened Walter. Holloway traced the phone records and discovered the calls had come from a disposable phone purchased at a nearby convenience store. Surveillance footage from the store revealed the buyer, Marcus. Holloway's heart raced. Inspector Grace Holloway's suspicions solidified. Marcus was the mastermind behind the chaos. He had manipulated Alex, threatened Walter, and likely orchestrated the murder when Walter refused to relinquish the medallion. But why? Was it greed, revenge, or something darker? Holloway decided to set a trap. She instructed Clara to call Marcus under the guise of wanting to return the medallion. Clara would lure him to a secluded location, claiming she feared for her life and wanted to be rid of the cursed object. The rendezvous was set for midnight at an abandoned warehouse near the edge of town. The location was chosen carefully to give Holloway's team the advantage. Officers hid strategically, and surveillance cameras were placed to capture every angle. As the time approached, Clara, wearing a wire, stood in the center of the warehouse, clutching an empty box meant to represent the medallion. Her hands trembled, but she held her ground. Minutes later, Marcus arrived, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He approached Clara cautiously, scanning the area. "Where's the medallion?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. Clara's voice wavered. "I hid it somewhere safe. I'll tell you where it is, but I need to know I'm safe first." Marcus smirked. "Safe? You've got no idea who you're dealing with." He reached into his coat, pulling out a gun. Clara gasped, stepping back. "Let's not play games," Marcus growled. "Give me the medallion, or you'll end up just like Walter." At that moment, Holloway and her team burst in, weapons drawn. "Drop the gun, Marcus. It's over." Marcus spun around, his face twisting in rage. "You think you're clever, don't you, Inspector?" he sneered. "You have no idea what that medallion is worth." "It's not worth your life," Holloway replied coldly. "Put the gun down." For a tense moment, it seemed Marcus might comply. But then he raised the gun, aiming it at Clara. Before he could fire, a single shot rang out. Holloway's sharpshooter had taken him down. Marcus collapsed to the ground, the gun slipping from his hand. Paramedics rushed in to confirm his death. With Marcus dead, the pieces of the case began falling into place. Walter had indeed been murdered over the medallion. Marcus had orchestrated the threats, manipulated Alex to deliver the item, and ultimately killed Walter when he refused to sell it back. However, there was one lingering mystery: the medallion itself. The following day, Holloway returned to the quarry. Guided by Clara's description, she found the medallion hidden in a crevice. It was smaller than she expected, but its craftsmanship was exquisite. Intricate engravings adorned the gold surface, and an inscription in Latin read, "Fortune favors the bold." Holloway held it carefully, her mind filled with questions. Could this tiny object really hold the power to incite greed, obsession, and death? She decided to have it examined by an expert. The results confirmed it was authentic and incredibly valuable, a piece of history worth millions. But there was no evidence of any curse. The deaths surrounding the medallion were simply the result of human greed and desperation. In the aftermath, Clara was released, her involvement deemed peripheral. Alex was charged with obstruction and accessory to the crime, but agreed to testify against Marcus's network, which extended far beyond Walter. The investigation revealed Marcus had been trafficking stolen artifacts for years, and Walter's death was just one of many violent incidents tied to his operation. The medallion was placed in a secure museum where it could no longer inspire chaos. Inspector Holloway sat at her desk, reflecting on the case. It wasn't the medallion that had killed Walter. It was the darkness in people's hearts. Greed, lies, and obsession had turned an artifact of history into a weapon. As she filed the case away, she couldn't help but wonder, how many more lives would be destroyed by humanity's endless hunger for power and wealth? The medallion's curse was no supernatural force, it was human nature. And that, Holloway knew, was the most dangerous thing of all.